This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Forget the frustration of picking commerce platforms when you switch your business to Shopify, the global commerce platform that supercharges your selling wherever you sell. With Shopify, you'll harness the same intuitive features, trusted apps, and powerful analytics used by the world's leading brands. Sign up today for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/tech, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/tech.
Hello and welcome to Audiobook Connection, behind the scenes with the creative teams. I'm Becky Parker-Geist and I'm your host. Audiobook Connection is your place to learn about the audiobook creative process in discussions between the authors, narrators, producers, and post-production teams that bring them all together, as well as guests who have listened to the audiobooks and have questions for the creative teams. This podcast is sponsored by Pro Audio Voices, helping great stories come alive through audiobook production and marketing. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today on Audiobook Connection. Today, I'm going to be interviewing Matt Strain. Matt recently left Adobe, where over the course of 17 years, he led teams across marketing, strategy, new business, and research. And now he's focused on helping real people like you and me prepare for the opportunities with AI. As you know, on this podcast, AI has been a controversial topic, and we've had some very different viewpoints on it. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Matt, recently the New York Times highlighted Matt's unique AI-generated book, which used AI to blend Chinese medicine and mixology, propelling him into the realm of micro-AI celebrity. Forbes has called him the AI whisperer. And then during his recent tenure at Adobe's research lab, Matt explored the intersection of AI and creativity, collaborating with teams to bring innovative new products and services to market. He was a leader in crafting Adobe's strategy to address fake news. In pursuit of AI's potential for positive impact, Matt's now experimenting with ways to bring the power of AI to a broad set of non-technical audiences. So he recently did a presentation for Bay Area Independent Publishers Association, and I was so impressed, I thought we should have him on the show to discuss this controversial topic in the narration world. So, Matt, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here, Becky. And I know I mentioned this to you before, but I do want to give you a shout out where in my 17 years at Adobe, I calculated that being at about approximately 40,000 meetings. And that session that you ran with the independent publishers was one of the most engaged community building meetings that I think I may have ever been to. So congratulations on that.
Thank you so much.
But it's exciting to be talking with authors and writers and narrators about this because I've been in and around the technology my whole career. And what I find really exciting now is the ability to use this technology to augment what we're already doing, to make us not just more productive, but to enhance our creativity.
Yeah. I like the way you use that word augment rather than replace. And so I think that's some of the tenor of what will be our conversation today, I expect.
I think it's interesting where that discussion of where does creativity begin and end? Where does human creativity, what does a tool do? So within the research team at Adobe, we had probably about 250 computer science PhDs, and many of them broke what your expectations would have been, right? Where there were deep discussions around the importance of human creativity and what it meant to be human and how those two things play together. So I think sometimes there's perception of engineers and product people just trying to drive the technology side of it for the sake of technology. But there's some really interesting discussions around how do we actually make people's lives more meaningful and more enriching with this technology.
Oh, that's great. I'm really glad to hear that. And I think that is one of the most interesting things about this time right now when we're facing these questions of AI. They also help us face the question of who are we as humans? You know, what is it that is particularly human about us? And then from my perspective, also very focused on the story. What is that? What's our relationship with story? And then how does AI kind of relate to us and story? What would you say are the biggest limitations right now of AI generated voices, because that's a big issue for us in this audiobook world. That what are the biggest limitations for long form narration as we have in audiobooks compared to human narrators?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is the nuance, right? So I think if you're doing something like a textbook, right, it's probably going to be fine. But as soon as you're dealing with human emotions, it's really hard to replicate that.
Yeah.
Because in this discussion right now, my response to your emotion isn't necessarily a series of words on a page. There's so much more, right? So there's surprise, there's empathy, there's compassion, and you can tell if that's genuine. It's also very contextual. And I think the other thing that we see more in the video side, and it's more used around the world of robotics, is the concept of uncanny valley, right? Where something gets close enough to being real, but it's not quite. And that really is disconcerting for people, right? They'd rather see something be clearly fake than see something be close, but not quite.
Right.
So I think for the foreseeable future, that's where, at least when it comes to fiction and novels and anything that carries an emotional, quality to it, if it's not absolutely genuine, people are going to detect it and they're going to pull back from it.
Yeah. What you brought up is really interesting because it made me immediately think about all those times when, even as human to human, when we are disingenuous, when we are saying one thing and maybe don't quite mean it, we sense that so quickly.
And for example, if you have a friend or a spouse who's distracted and you ask them a question and they come back and they're not connected, as you were saying, you can see that immediately, right?
Yeah.
And I think the other thing that gets tricky is when you start dealing with regional accents or different accents or genders or ages, right? I mean, that also has a very distinct feel. Even though they're not all the same, you can really tell a lot from just the quality of somebody's voice or the cadence or, how they present themselves.
Yeah. Even just with accents, just like regional dialects, I think partly, I've mentioned this on previous podcasts where, we sometimes have the idea when we're writing that our characters have a particular accent. And one of the things I find really interesting is that when we look at the amount of travel that most people, now that's not going to always pertain to a specific character in a book, but that most people are engaged in, those accents, those regional dialects, man, they just get all smashed together and mixed around. And they're not this distinct thing that we used to see when travel and also just global communication. Being on Zoom calls with other people on a regular basis can start to affect the way that you say certain words. So that's also interesting.
It's also interesting, like with what you're doing with the podcast. I hadn't really thought about this before, but when you're reading a book, right, you don't hear the accent. You might get it with how it's written, but there is that whole other level of communication that comes in when you can actually hear or see somebody.
Yeah. So
I think in some ways, what's happening with podcasts and narration is going to take the writing process to the whole next level, right? So I think that's really interesting. And at some point in the future, right, it's all about data. And one of the reasons now we can't do it is because we don't have enough data to understand each regional accent and how that interplays. So for now, a knowledgeable narrator, is invaluable, right? If you understand, I've got a good friend who's he's British and he reads audiobooks, and his knowledge of the different nuances of the British accents is marvelous, right?
Yeah.
But to replace that is going to be very, very difficult.
Right.
Now, having said that, I do think there are some ways to enhance, what we're all doing with podcasts and narration, right? So it could be if you're reading a story about a windy, rainy night with thunder, right? There may be some ways that you could augment that, where you could detect what's happening in a scene and provide some suggestions for background. So that's, I think it's like we were saying before, it's not going to be one or the other, right? It's going to be, you have people do what they do best. And I think the emotion side of it is going to be absolutely critical on that and how you convey emotion. But there are other things that we can imagine that I think would really enhance what's being done with a narration.
Yeah. You talked a little bit about that artistry, that emotional resonance that we experience with human performances. Do you think that AI is ever going to hit the mark, the human mark of being true to the human experience?
So I think the one challenge we have when people compare AI to humans, we sort of pick the absolute best human example that we can imagine, where that human is connected and listening and is empathetic. I don't know, a lot of the friends I talk to, their partners or their bosses aren't really that empathetic. There's a story of a surgeon who had very poor bedside manner, and he was using ChatGPT or one of the other tools to actually give him a script that he could use when explaining bad news to a family. So I think there are cases where people have bad judgment or they're a poor communicator that I actually think we'll see it like around therapy and around advice, right? So I've seen people who have a hard time communicating with their son or with their partner. And if you ask these, I use nonviolent communication as a framework, right? So if you ask it, using the framework of nonviolent communication, how would you express your frustration about this to this person, And, you can rant in your prompt and it comes back and it says, Matt, these are the 4 steps. Objectively state what you saw. How does it make you feel? What do you need? Mm-hmm. So I think there's going to be an interplay.
Interesting.
And I think there's certainly plenty of movies about and recent episodes on the news of people that have fallen in love with an avatar that looks nothing like them. Uh-huh. I mean, I think my initial reaction is that's very sad, but it does underlie I think, condition in society where a lot of people feel lonely and disconnected. So I think there's always going to be that depth of emotional connection, but I think there is a role for some of this to play in terms of how you support people and how you can give them a path to communicate.
Yeah. You've reminded me of Rags Parkland, which is a show so big shout out to Ars Nova in New York City, off-Broadway company. And I worked on that show when they did it at Ars Nova, and it was all about, takes place in the future and they're having this concert, but there are the people who have all human parts, and then there are the constructeds, those people. So there's something that sort of rings, that a similar bell in terms of the issues that come up. It was a really brilliant way of calling out the way that we are prejudicial against those that we feel are other. Mm-hmm. And yet there is also this question of what are we? When do we still get to call ourselves human? When are we not?
Yeah, I think there's a playfulness in that makes us human and unexpected, right?
Yeah.
So, for example, if I go out to dinner with my kids and if I'm just joking around with the waiter or waitress, right? I mean, we have a way of knowing when somebody's open to being playful and when they're not, right? Yeah. And my kids are cringy because they're like, oh my God, Dad. But you end up in most cases having a nice friendly rapport and everybody feels better at the end of it. But I think understanding where that is, and if that was taken away, so we all were not politically correct, but if we were cautious the entire time, we'd miss some of that playfulness.
Yeah.
Having said that though, if we had known each other for 10 or 15 years, right? At least I know for me, I have friends and I've forgotten some of the key milestones in their life, what has happened and so forth, that if there was a way before I hopped on a call or saw somebody, I could just be reminded of what they had gone through, of when a parent had passed away or somebody had been sick or a milestone. That would help me, I think, be more empathetic. Uh-huh. Or if I was meeting somebody or even writing for an audience that was from a different culture, right? And I've played with this a little bit too, where you write a piece and you're like, okay, how would somebody who, grew up in Northern Africa, respond to this, right? Is there anything here that might trigger a response that is unexpected or unwanted? So I think there's some things that kind of comes into the augmentation side of things, where there might be something that I knew at one point and forgot, or I didn't know, that would help me be, a more supportive or more engaged friend.
Yeah. I can certainly see how those people who are working cross-culturally, ambassadors and, others who are working, even just businesses that maybe have a division in another country with dealing with different cultures in that way, how that kind of assistance could be really valuable.
Even, some of it like that cross-cultural training, right? Most major companies will have subscribed to some kind of a training that gives you an overview before you travel somewhere that most people never watch or never attend. But I think if it was something where it could be on your phone, And it could say, I'm in this sticky situation. What's the best way to move forward? Right. I mean, there's some assistive things around that, which I had a friend years ago who was an engineer, and he tried to create an app for when he was on a date. He could like do an SOS and he would like get some feedback. And the idea was that your date would go to the restroom and you would sort of try to figure out the next thing to say. That didn't really go quite the way he thought it was going to go. Yeah. But I think, now with AI, there are possibly some things that you could do to support it, right? And again, I think it comes back to how can you use these things to support what it is we're trying to do in building connection, right? Rather than replace it.
Yeah. Building connection. So important. Yeah. Can you speak more as to like why you think that AI is not really, let's say this, since our world is audiobook narration. So in the world of audiobook narration, why is it that you think that AI narrators are not able to capture that emotional resonance, that artistry?
Yeah, I mean, some of it has to do with the technology, right, and the ability to reproduce the nuance of a particular emotion. So it has to do with a couple things. One is I need to understand what you're coming at me with, or a character is, right? You need to understand the context, and then you need to be able to express it. So, for example, expressing genuine surprise, right, is a really hard thing to do. So if somebody has already opened the gift the night before that you're going to give them, it's very hard for them to act surprised when they see it, right? And you know that, right? So if you think about what a computer system needs to do, then they need to take that, they need to analyze it and understand how you attribute genuine surprise to fake surprise. And that's an incredibly sophisticated technique. It's much easier if you're doing a textbook and you need to start a new chapter or a new chapter head and you pause and do that kind of thing.
Yeah.
We see the same thing with writing, right? So for years, financial reports have been written automatically, right? That's no surprise. If you read the response to a financial earnings report, that's pretty much programmatic, right? Somebody may read it. But if you're doing something which is far more nuanced, or an interview or an investigative journalist piece, there is nuance to that, which is harder. And it's one thing to do it in writing. It's so much harder to capture all the additional dimensions when you hear a spoken word.
Yeah.
But I think the ability, just to summarize, the ability to kind of ingest that and then to speak it back in a way that is genuine and connects, particularly when it's something emotional, right? So if you think of, again, if it's a romantic conversation or a surprise or a shock, you can do it with audio effects, but to get the audio, like a sound effect, but to do it with a voice is incredibly complex to do.
Yeah. Yeah. You shared with me the last time we spoke, you shared with me a story about your daughter who is a writer. And I would love for you to share that on this podcast about, if the same text were written by AI or human.
Yeah. So she called me out. I had a pretty big group I was presenting to, and I lean on being cautiously optimistic about technology. So that's sort of my bias coming into this. Mm-hmm. And she's like, yeah, Dad, all this AI stuff is nice, but if you have the same set of words on a page that's written by a person compared to written by, an AI, you have a very different reaction to that, right? So theoretically, if I took all the information that I know or could know about you, and if I have access to everything that's ever been written, every great piece of literature, I could create a set of words that would trigger tremendous emotion by your having read it, right? But if you're reading a poem, and if it's auto-generated by, Chat GPT 7 or somebody who has really thought about it and struggled with it, I guarantee you're going to have a different reaction to the one that somebody sweated over versus something that was generated automatically. Yeah. And I bet most of us who are, anyone listening to this, I assume, would feel the same way, that there's a human learned experience and struggle that you go through to create a story where you would read that, but you might not read it if it was automatically generated, even though the words might be exactly the same.
Yeah.
So and that gets back to, when audiobooks are read by machines and by models that sound more genuine, and I think it was like a year or so ago, we saw that Apple was licensing voices. I don't recall the details on that.
Yeah.
But I think we're getting to a place where people are going to want disclosure, right? Is this written by a human? Is it spoken by a human? And if it's not, the ethical thing to do will be to to come clean with that. And there are plenty of cases where if it's an obscure book or something, and there are reasons why you need to read it while you're traveling, or if you're visually impaired, I think there are a lot of reasons why this technology could be, put to very, very good use. Mm-hmm. But I think most people will want full disclosure that whether or not it's a human behind it or not.
Yeah. I noticed while looking into what are some of the samples that are provided for companies that are like BookBaby that are, promoting the idea of AI narration, and looking at those samples, and they have names as if they're narrated by a human, which I found really disturbing. Like, I really wanted to know, is this so obvious? My assumption is that they sourced from that person. They sourced the voice from that person. But it felt to me like they were trying to trick me. And I don't appreciate that.
Well, I mean, it's also in marketing, that is one of the things you do, right? Is you come up with your persona and you describe them as fully and as specifically as you can. Mm-hmm. So if you are picking a person to read your book and you want somebody who fits a particular profile with life story and this and that, and as many of the people may have seen with ChatGPT 4 now, you can put in background in there in context that says, here's who I am and here's what I do. So possibly you could say, I want somebody of a similar cultural background or not, of an age who sounds like this, a mixture of these two characters. I want an Obama and somebody else mixed together to read it. So I think there will be sort of some playfulness that comes around that. But this is sort of I don't know if it's the dark side, but if you're trying to market that voice as a narrator, you're going to give it as much humanity as you possibly can.
Right. Yeah.
Oh,
I don't know.
Yeah, I agree. It's mixed because here's where it gets tricky, because there are use cases and reasons why you would want this. So at Adobe, Stephen Hawking's estate and other estates of people who'd either lost their voice or passed away had come to us with recordings and said, would you recreate the voice? Because Adobe has had the technology for years. They released a preview of it publicly about 8 years ago, the voice synthesis technology. But being a responsible company, they never released it because of all the ethical issues around it. But when people had seen the technology was there, they came up and said, my child is no longer able to speak, but we do have some recordings. Could you give him his voice back artificially? Right. Mm-hmm. So, or, if you're a movie studio and you paid an actor and it's in their contract, it's understood that if you can't come back to replace this one line because you're in Europe, can we automatically generate a line of voice? Yeah. So those are all uses that I think a lot of companies are like, oh, those are legitimate uses. But of course, then you have the flip side where, is the area that we're getting into now, and we'll only see more of it as we get closer to the election, right? We're already starting to see those early signs that there are going to be some nasty things coming.
Yeah. Let's take a short pause and we'll pick up where we left off when we get back.
Frustrated by the royalty rates for your audiobook? Annoyed that when the digital distributors say 70%, they actually mean 70% of 50% or 80% of 70%, neither of which is an actual 70%? Wishing there was a way to earn more from each sale? Pro Audio Voices hears you. Out of our commitment to our author clients, we've created Amplify Audiobooks, a program that provides an actual 65% royalties of the sales price you set, that gives you access to your customers' names and emails so you can reconnect with them and build your community and following, and keeps you in the driver's seat. Create coupon codes or schedule a sale with promotional pricing. Amplify Audiobooks gives you the tools to effectively market your audiobooks and a much higher return on every single purchase. Check it out at proaudiovoices.com or go direct to proaudiovoices.app. And for listeners, visit amplifyaudiobooks.com to find your next great listen. The Amplify Audiobooks app is now available on both app stores.
Do you think that AI will ever authentically voice characters of different ages and accents and dialects that we human narrators specialize in? Do you think it's going to learn those nuances?
Yeah, I'll give you a technical answer.
Okay.
It all depends on the data. So if it's able to collect enough data by enough people, then probably. I mean, I think there will always be. So the answer will be, if you remember where some of these things were, I keep thinking like a Clippy from Microsoft, which was probably 20 years ago, right? Really, really rough, right? And there are computer voices that are on Siri and other things that are bad. They've gotten better over the last couple of years. So there will be things that get better and get closer to sounding real. But I think what that may do is push book narrators to be more innovative. I obviously I don't know the space as well as you do, but a lot of the audiobooks I listen to are, essentially people reading the written word. So is there a way that, you start to get more nuance or more different accents or different things taking place? So and I don't know what the answer to it is, but so that's a question I would ask you is, are there things that narrators have wanted to do that they can't do? So that's one scenario. Then the other thing that I've heard of is if you're writing a book, you could basically say, I want this character to speak with this accent. I want second character to be this age and speak this way. And it's still not very good, but you could automate multiple voices coming out of a story in ways that might be more challenging for a person to do because you wouldn't have that many people.
Yeah.
I think the hope for it is you actually have this renaissance of how narrators are looking at doing things that could allow them to push in new and more aggressive directions to try some new things that haven't been tried for a while.
Yeah. I've had some interesting conversations with Joshua Townsend, and we actually have another episode that'll be coming up with him where we were talking about this question and what is that very human thing, and about the emotional connection to the words, to the story, and how that transforms it and raises it. So and his take on AI was, it's some narrators they're going to lose their work because they're not at the top of their game. And so I can see that. And also, we've seen manuscripts come through that the author's written, where you need like 15 different authentic accents, and that can be almost impossible for a single narrator to do effectively. And so, but then you're really getting into another, and actually a realm that in some ways we specialize in at Pro Audio Voices, because we love doing full cast projects with humans. But just saying that, I guess you could just plug in for specific characters dialogue that the narrator can't manage, but I think you'd end up with a very choppy, very substandard finished audiobook that is not going to be a good listener experience. As a listener, I would rather have a narrator who's doing a very light accent, a version, something that suggests it without it being accurate to, and even when I go to accurate, I'm thinking, what is accurate anymore? Because we're not living in this separated world.
Yeah. And I mean, we had talked about this before too, it's not about precision, right? Because precision can be very cold. Right. So that's why we go to see improv, right? Because you don't know where it's going to go. You don't know what that interaction is going to be. So I think the idea of having a mistake or hearing humanity is actually what we're going to want. Yeah. So, I mean, that should be a relief for a lot of us who are not perfect.
Yes, right? Definitely.
But I think, getting back to your question of if you wrote a script that had, I'm thinking of India, where you have very different accents and tones depending on where you are in the country, right? I mean, that could be programmed, right? So with enough data, you could say this is an intonation that resembles such and such a spot. There was an interesting thing on NPR a while ago where they were talking about a woman, and they kind of did this as a fun game. So she was Chinese American. She had a number of other Chinese Americans who came on, and they would call up and they would say, they would read two sentences, and she would have to guess how long they'd been in the States. And the way she did that was, I think it was urban and rural, right? where the word rural, she would pick it up because if you're not a native, even if you're a native English speaker, it's a tricky word. But if you're a non-native English speaker, there are a handful of words that people struggle on, and that's an indicator of like how new you are to the language in some ways, right? Which I thought, and I was thinking about it in the context of this, where there are those things that if you hear that, that's the kind of thing where if you hear it, you don't necessarily know why, but you just realize that that person paused a fraction too long there. But it will be at some point with enough compute power and with enough data, that's the kind of thing that's a pattern that would be detected. But I think realistically, that's years away.
Yeah.
And I do think the answer to a lot of this is as simple as people seeking connection and authenticity. And if you're listening to a book in the car or when you're going to bed, to know that it's not read by a machine, but it's read by a human at the other. But it may be that, people who are narrators step up their branding, right? So it's not just about, I'm going to buy an audiobook, but it's like, I'm going to buy it from this particular person and I know their backstory, and that backstory has some connection to it.
Yeah. I think, thank you for sort of teeing this up, but this very element of community is a big part of why our company developed Amplify audiobooks, is because it's one of our core values is community, being able to help authors build their communities, to be in community with authors and narrators and finding those connections and helping create a platform where those connections can be more effectively built and developed and nurtured. I love what you said there about, that with the community and our choices around what audiobooks we're going to buy. And I think also with Amplify audiobooks, it also then ties into, and where will I buy it?
Right.
Am I going to go to Audible and get it there? And if I recognize that the author is never going to know that I got their audiobook, they're not going to have any way to reach out to me. I'm not going to have any way to connect with them. They're not going to get much of anything from what I just paid to Amazon. I think the more that we understand those things, and I do think they all tie into the question of community and our connection and our care for each other, that I think that we will gradually make the changes that are so important.
I couldn't agree more. And I think as questions about AI accelerate and as climate issues and these other things start accelerating, which unfortunately it looks like they're going to, I think that's going to draw people together.
Yeah.
And when I started off, I was talking about how special I thought the session that you ran and the community around it. And since then, I've had another session with a group of 20 fairly senior leaders talking about an AI issue. And because of that, I extended the time of the breakout rooms, and we had a couple different breakout rooms. And watching them have a person-to-person connection and actually lean in and talk about things rather than sitting back, that was the most connected part for them. And I'm quite sure they learned the most out of that. So I think sort of the artisanal narration world, if you will, I mean, it's moving that way with buying local and some of the other things, that the idea of like, listen to an author or a narrator who it would surprise me if that doesn't run in parallel with, what is going to be AI affecting the space.
Yeah.
But personally, I think one of the things that's most exciting is how do we use AI to foster really valuable connections with people, right?
Yes.
Because there are times that even if you're done reading a book, right, or listening to a book, I mean, there's somebody else online somewhere in the world who has just finished reading the book, probably within half an hour of you, right? So what if you could have that like pop-up book club that comes? So I think there are things like that will help, hopefully, use the technology to weave us together a little bit tighter.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. I love that. I love your perspective on that, on the use of AI to bring us closer together and to be really as a tool, not as a replacement. There was something that I have heard from someone else talking about AI, about if we were to just stop creating, like if we were just say, okay, AI, we'll mop the floors, you write the books, then they wouldn't get any better. They would really stagnate.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it will go hand in hand. And I just, I also think the more we can lean in and understand what's happening with AI, the better off we're all going to be as citizens to have an informed point of view. because it's very easy to get afraid of it. And there are things to be afraid of, like there are with many things. But I would just encourage people to try it out, to figure out how it can make your life a little more productive, a little more creative. And then at least you'll have a sense of where some of those boundaries are and what it can and can't do. And, for a brief period of time, I did some whitewater kayaking. So I can use this sort of metaphor where like the scariest part is before you jump in the water. Once you jump in, you're in it and you've got to figure it out. It's sort of like parenthood, right? So I think it's kind of like with AI. There are a lot of people who are sitting back, watching it, saying it's not very good, it doesn't work, it's going to replace people. But it's here, and it's been here for 10 or 15 years in various ways, just not quite as evident as it is now.
Yeah. And you talked a little bit about this earlier, but maybe going a little deeper on, do you think publishers and platforms should disclose when audiobook narration is AI generated instead of human?
Oh, I think they've got an ethical obligation to do it, because if you're depicting it as human and it's not, then you should. I mean, it's transparency. It has to do with trust. So I think that's the other big sort of meta issue here is one around trust, where, deep fakes and fake news and all of these things is, it used to be there was a fear that people were going to believe things that were not true, right? But I think the fear now, and this was actually written up in the World Economic Forum's Global Threat Report, the risk being that people aren't going to believe anything. So that when someone comes to you with a fact, you're like, I don't believe that, right? Or when they show you something that's happening, like, I don't believe there were, fires in Hawaii or whatever, right? So people aren't going to believe it. And that's a scary thing, because that allows people to pull back and have even more division than we have today.
Yeah. I mean, we already have a fair amount of that. People who don't believe that rockets are being shot out into space all the time, even though the globe is surrounded by satellites. We have a whole network of them up there.
Yeah.
Or don't believe that the climate is changing, or there's so many things that it's a little mind-boggling, but it's that
does really be like, I'm actually more concerned right now with human intelligence than I am about artificial. So
that's great.
You can complain about artificial intelligence once you crack that human intelligence issue, and I'll be happy to have a different conversation. But no, I think it is. It's like, it's being truthful, it's being forthright. It's like, it's labeling these things for what they are. And, to say something is generated by AI, I don't think is a bad thing. I mean, if AI has access to this vast treasure trove and they never forget anything and they learn, 4 million times faster than humans do. Okay, there are times that that's a very helpful thing to have, right? There are other times when it's not.
Yeah. So big picture, because I always like to, again, this is one of our core values. One of mine personally is impact. What is the impact that you are having or intending to have with the work you're doing currently?
Yeah, that's a question that I ask myself all the time. So part of the reason I left Adobe, I love the company. It was great. I love the things that they were doing. But having been in tech for so long, I want to figure out a way to make it sort of help people be more productive and more creative. So, I'm working with a wide range of companies and things, but what I'm really trying to do is to work with, sort of real people who can use this to make their days a little more magical and more productive and free up time for what they really want to do. And I think that's looking at things in a rationally optimistic way. So to be like, okay, there are risks, and I can only address so many things, but if I can help people think about how they can use this to make things a little bit better, whether that be how they educate themselves and their families. So you have education, you've got climate, you've got diet, you've got health. There are all these different ways. But I think with these devices and what's happening, there's some really, really positive things that we can do to help people. So that's the impact I want to have. And if I can have people look at something and be like, oh, that's interesting, I can do that different, or I can communicate with somebody better, or any of the types of things that we've talked about, right? Yeah. Then I've had a positive impact around this stuff.
That's great. How can listeners learn more about what you're up to? You have a website you'd like them to go to if they want to find out more?
I do, yeah. So I having said all this, my website does not necessarily reflect a great deal of artificial intelligence, or intelligence on my part, I should say. But if you go to theprompt.ai, and because I got into this a little later than everybody else who registered, it's the-prompt.ai. There you've got some background. I do have a like a 9-page prompt guide up that people can download that tells you, here are some guides on how to do prompt and different types of roles and so forth. So, I theoretically, I have some form of communication that I'll send out once I get around to doing that. But one of the things I am doing, and again, this was sparked by what you did in your session and others since then, is I'm going to start, I think it's going to be a Friday lunch Pacific time brown bag session, in addition to like the other specific things that I do. But just to have an open session where people can pop in, share what they're doing, and talk about what's working, what's not working. And then, kind of as a collective, we can come around and help each other out with it. Because I think that's, rather than listening to another pre-recorded episode or something that shows up on Instagram, hearing other people that you can relate to talking about what works and doesn't work.
Yeah.
One, it sort of establishes that human connection, but it also helps people understand that this stuff isn't as scary, or maybe that it is more scary. They need to be careful in a couple different areas.
Yeah, great. And just for those people who, since we didn't maybe cover that term, the prompt, just to clarify for our listeners, in case that's an unfamiliar term to them in this context, would you like to clarify?
Yeah. So, it could, the word prompt has been around for a long time, but in the world of AI, the prompt is really that question that you ask, in this case, the chatbot or the text to image generator. So, the classic early one was write a haiku about my dog eating a banana or something like that. Or, explain, anything that you are asking the chatbot to do. But one of the biggest issues I find for people who say, oh, I use this ChatGPT or any of the others, and it doesn't work very well, it's because they didn't know how to ask it or how to interact with it. So there's some very specific things that you can do. So things like tell it what you want it to do, tell it how you want it to act, right? And be very specific in what the output is. So for example, act as a book editor. Please review this chapter in the style of the New York Times style guide, right? And give me the top 5 things I should do to improve it, right? Or anything like that. So if you just ask it for help or insight, it will give you something generic back. It's like if you're talking to a lawyer or anyone else, the more specific you can be with who you are and what you want, the better you'll get out the result out the back end. So that's kind of where it came from, because I was helping a lot of people just say, this is how you use these things. This is how you get up and running.
Yeah. And also just sort of a disclaimer note, I guess, in a way, is remembering that even if you ask a question about gathering facts, that you may not get actual factual response.
Yep.
You have to know that it's not always going to give you back the truth.
Right. And just by nature of how it works, it will give you a slightly different answer each time, which isn't a bad thing. It's like if you ask me a question tomorrow that you asked me today, I may come up with 3 out of the same 5 things, right? Yeah. But it'll be different.
Yeah.
And it can't be fully trusted, right? And the thing to keep in mind is like these models have, all this information in, but not all the information is accurate, right? So it's like any of us, we're filled with hopefully more accurate information than inaccurate, but you need to question the source. And that's one of the things that's hard, is because you don't necessarily know what the source is, unlike Google, where it sends you to a particular place. So you can ask these models, tell me what the source is. Some do a better job than others, which is also why I'm glad you brought this up, because when you work with these tools, if you're working with something that's creative, right, that's okay if it's not perfect, right? If you're asking it to write something, there's a lot of leeway in that. If you're asking it for financial or medical advice, right, that's a different story, right? It can inform your decision. So on something like that, I kind of look at these tools as asking a really smart friend who's read a lot, but might be wrong. And the other challenge with them is there's no confidence indicator. So what that means is it's your friend who is always, for the sake of like being sort of reinforcing gender, always mansplaining, right, what this thing is, because all these things are completely confident in what they do. But you can go back and you say, don't make things up, and it will come back with a better answer, which seems ridiculous. The other last sort of trick with it is, if it's something complicated, you can ask it, tell me step by step how you would get to this answer. And there's something about asking it to do it sequentially that gets you to a much better result than a more detailed and more accurate result. So,
Yeah,
I mean,
great.
these are things that, as you get into it and as you learn these things and work with the tools, there's a lot of support out there for it. But it's like anything else. It does take a while to really master how to work with these things.
Yeah. Well, Matt, I want to thank you so much for taking this time with me and being a guest on the podcast. This has been great. And look forward to chatting with you again, some months down the road, and we'll see where things are then.
Would love to. Thank you, Becky. It's been fun.
All right. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks again for joining us here at Audiobook Connection. If you have questions that you would like to have me address or have guests to address on the podcast, please reach out to us at proaudiovoices.com. There's a way to contact us there and ask your questions. Would love to hear from you. Have an awesome day. Thanks again for being with us. Thanks for joining us for Audiobook Connection, behind the scenes with the creative teams. Please take a moment to subscribe at audiobookconnection.com. The podcast is sponsored by Pro Audio Voices, helping great stories come alive through audiobook production and marketing. Learn more at proaudiovoices.com. Again, thanks for being with us, and please join us next week.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.